What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Necromancer tank. So the Necro tank is a pretty unique playstyle when it comes to tanking, mainly due to the fact that you don't really have any sort of debuffs or buffs you really need to maintain. The Necromancer doesn't provide any sort of group utility outside of their existing active skills. So there's no passives that grant things like minor toughness or minor brutality or anything like that. So in terms of a Necro tank, pretty much all of your buffs are going to be coming from skills, so it's going to be a little bit more of an active playstyle compared to something like a Dragonite perhaps. In addition, Necro tanks also have the potential to be very good ultimate generators, mainly due to the fact that they're able to use their corpses of their certain abilities in order to generate ultimate. And so I have tried out Necro tanks in the past, and I found them to be pretty enjoyable. Definitely different from playing a Dragonite or a Warden tank, but definitely more than capable of clearing all pieces of content in the game. So definitely a fun and a little bit different tanking class compared to, at the very least, the traditional DK or Warden tanks. So just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know to recreate this build yourself. Instead of doing a parse at the end of the video, instead we'll be discussing kind of how the Necro tank differs from the DK tank, and the general philosophies and sort of what you want to be looking for as you're practicing out your tanking abilities. We'll also be talking a lot about the different skills and sets that you're going to want to have on hand as a tank here, mainly because as a support role, you need to be able to be very flexible with the skills and abilities that you're running, depending on the specific trial, depending on whether you're doing 4-man content, depending on what your raid lead wants to do in terms of strategy. So I'll talk about some of the more popular and more common sets that you should have as a tank. But without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started here, first with gear. So in terms of Monster Helm sets, this is just one Monster Helm set. There are several Monster Helm sets that are pretty decent options here. So we have a Lord Warden, which comes from Imperial City Prison. Pretty much all the Monster Helm sets I'm going to be talking about do require some sort of DLC, so if you're going to be tanking endgame content, endgame PvE content, I do recommend picking up ESO Plus or trying to get a specific DLC for the Monster Helms that you need. So, Lord Warden requires the Imperial City DLC. This just basically gives out a bunch of resistances both to you and to other allies, which is always great for survivability. It is a classic set to go to when you really don't know what else you need to run. There are a few other Monster Helm sets, though, that you should consider picking up as a tank. I'll be going through these pretty much in the order that we see here. So the first one that we're going to see here is going to be for tanks. For Necro tanks specifically, it's going to be Swarm Mother. Very situationally useful here because you do have a sort of class pull already. Swarm Mother just sort of amplifies that a little bit because there is a 3-second cooldown on your own personal pull. So useful when you need it. Then we have Earthgore, which is actually not a bad set to get as a tank here. At the very least in certain scenarios. So it only heals one target as opposed to multiple targets as it used to be in the past here. But it will only proc whenever you need it. And so if you're in a situation where you know you're going to need some burst heals and you know that damage is going to be coming every 35 seconds or more, Earthcore is actually not that bad of a set. But it's situations where you're going to be using it to its full potential are going to be fairly limited. So I wouldn't necessarily waste time farming Earthcore. Next we have Bloodspawn here, which is probably the only full Monster Helm set that the base game players are actually able to use. You basically gain a lot of ultimate whenever you take damage. I should say you have a chance to generate ultimate when you take damage, as well as increase your overall resistances. You're not going to be running the set for the resistance bonus. It's very inconsistent, so obviously you don't want to rely on this in order to guess your survivability, your resistances. Instead you'll be using it to generate ultimate, which will give you your Warhorn, get your Warhorn up faster, which allows you to have higher major force uptime, which overall improves overall DPS. Next we have Thurvokun, which pretty much gives out an AoE minor maim or minor defile whenever you take damage, so really great for trash pulls because you might not be able to apply minor maim on everything. So really great for trash pulls here, not so great on boss fights because you have Heroic Slash which already applies minor maim on the boss. Then we have Vykosa, so whenever you bash an enemy you've taunted, you apply major maim to them for 3 seconds, and this can occur once every 15 seconds. This is really great for progression stuff, as well as just general survivability. It does require you to have some advanced knowledge of the fight mechanics itself, so you know what moves and when you need to bash. But the Major Maim is a very valuable debuff in terms of reducing damage. The only other source of Major Maim comes from ultimates, the Templar Ultimate Solar Prison. And so being able to do this pretty much on demand every 15 seconds is really great. Doesn't last for quite as long as Solar Prison, only lasts for 3 seconds, but when timed correctly, it can really improve overall group survivability. Next we have Stonekeeper, which is a more selfish-oriented set, so whenever you block an attack, you gain an energy charge up to 1 stack per second. When you gain 6 of these charges, you release the energy, restoring 5350 stamina and magicka, as well as healing for 5350 as well. Once you release the charges, you cannot regain new charges for 14 seconds. This gives it essentially a 20-second cooldown, so this actually ends up being a very good self-sustain Monster Helm set, assuming that you're able to get a stack every second. If you're able to get this on a 20-second cooldown, it is a very strong self-sustain set, but it doesn't provide any sort of reap utility at all, so kind of limited in its overall use. If you need to kind of focus on self-sustain, then obviously this set is the way to go, but for group utility, you will want to shift to other potential sets. Finally, we have Symphony of Blades, so whenever you heal an ally who's under 50% of their primary resource, you restore 23-25 magicka or stamina every second for 6 seconds. This effect can occur every 18 seconds. So this is a very powerful support set. This is one of the strong support sets in the game. It does require you to use some sort of ability that does heal other people. So something like Blood Altar or Intensive Mender also works to help proc Symphony of Blades. But the resource return is incredibly powerful for overall DPS sustain. It allows them to sustain their rotation for a longer period of time. Generally speaking, this will improve DPS. So definitely a set that you want to grab for any support role, tank, and healer. Moving on to our sets here. So the first 5-piece set we have is going to be Ebon Armory. This is a base game set from Crypt of Hearts, and this is going to be one of the best support sets that a tank can wear. You pretty much see this across the board in both progression and endgame PvE guilds, just for the additional max health. It basically allows your DPS to focus less on increasing their health and more on increasing their damage resource and just focusing on doing DPS. So yes, the 1000 max health does actually help out, especially when you consider that this is before any sort of modifiers like CPs, minor toughness, and so on. The next set is going to be Yolnahkriin, which comes from Sunspire. The perfected version comes from Veteran Sunspire. Doesn't have to be hard mode, it can be non-hard mode here. So this is the only source in the game right now for Minor Courage, which usually ends up being anywhere between a 2 to 3% increase in DPS, depending on what your base weapon and spell damage is. So pretty strong boost overall. Not going to be quite as strong as some other bonuses, but because it is the only unique source of Minor Courage, the only source of Minor Courage, it is a set that you definitely want to have on at least one of your tanks in endgame groups. Very much like Ebon, Yolnahkriin will always be in any sort of raid group, whether that's progression or like true sort of speedrunners, score runner kind of groups. Definitely a set that you want to have on hand. Before we move on to other sets, I do want to talk about your armor traits and enchants and so on. So there's a couple of schools of thoughts here when it comes to traits here. So I personally prescribe to having Infused on my large pieces, so that's my helm, chest, and legs, as well as, and then I have Sturdy on my small pieces as well as my shield. So that would be shoulders, hands, waist, feet, and shield are all sturdy. Then I have Prismatic enchant on my large pieces and then I use my small pieces to kind of figure out what exactly I need. So it could be health, stamina, or magicka, depending on what sort of resource I feel I need the most here. Generally speaking, the safest way to go would be just to get flat max health. The other sort of school of thought is just to run all sturdy pieces here. Across the board here, you would still stick with the Prismatic enchants on your large pieces, or wherever you want to stick Prismatic enchants, but you would just be swapping out the trait for Sturdy. Sturdy would give you a little bit better stamina sustain when it comes to blocking. Infused would give you a little bit more resources out of your Prismatic enchants, so kind of pick whichever one works best for you. For jewelry, in terms of enchants, you really have two options when it comes to enchants here. So you have shield plate enchants, which reduce the cost of block, or you have magicka regen glyphs. Those will obviously give you more magicka regen. That will allow you to use more of your buff, debuff abilities here. So pretty much all of your abilities will use magicka except for your taunt and minor heroic slash. So it's important to have that magicka regen going. So that's why we would use magicka regen glyph. In terms of traits, I really like to have at the very least one harmony on my tank, and that's just because it gives me some additional resources whenever I get a shard or an orb. You don't have to go with harmony. Generally speaking, it's not really a awesome trait. It's just something that I personally prefer. A safe trait would be something like Triune, which gives you basically a prismatic enchant. You can also go with Arcane, Robust, Healthy, depending on which stat you need. You can go with Infused for stronger enchants here, so you have a little bit of flexibility when it comes to your jewelry trait. As for your front bar trait, your sword and board, doesn't really matter which trait you get because all of them are actually fairly bad. The best ones are probably going to be Decisive, Infused, or Charged. Decisive to get you more Warhorns, Infused if you're using enchants to get a stronger enchant, and then Charge if you're running a shock damage glyph on the back bar to help improve concussed uptime, which improves off bounce uptime. So generally speaking, not that many great options when it comes to front bar traits, so just kind of pick whichever one you need the most at this point. Enchants, same thing here, because it's a one-handed enchant, they're all fairly weak, so I have an Absorb Stamina enchant here to get my stamina sustain up. You can go with Absorb Health, Absorb Magicka, Weakening, anything like that. Shock damage enchant, even to help concussed uptime. Not a lot of great choices here when it comes to enchants, but a lot of flexibility. Alternatively, you could run something like a Minor Breach or Minor Fracture Poison, depending on your DPS configuration. For your back bar, you have a couple options when it comes to the specific type of weapon. So you could just double up on sword and board if you'd like, or you can go with what's more traditionally now, staves or bow. So you can have a frost staff if you want more mitigation, lightning staff to help with off bounce uptime, or a bow if you're going to be doing some off DPS and want some additional DPS there. In terms of traits, you're almost always going to be going with Infused for the stronger enchants, and in terms of enchants, you're really going to pick one of two main options, which are going to be Crusher or Shock, depending on whether your healers are running Crusher or not. Generally speaking, whatever enchant your healers are running, you'll be running the opposite. So if your healers are running Crusher, you'd be running Shock damage, for example. You might want to run something like Weakening as well. Again, it really depends on what the raid lead has each support running. Some groups have Crusher on their healers, in which case that opens up the enchants on your tanks for something like Weakening or Shock damage or something like that. Moving on, we're going to talk about the different sets here, and we're going to start first with dungeon sets. In terms of heavy dungeon sets, there really aren't that many outside of Ebon that you should have on hand. One that I do like to talk about is going to be, well, first let's talk about Leeching Plate here, just going down the line here. So this is really great for trash pulls, just deal some poison damage whenever you take damage, and you heal for that damage that's caused. It is an AoE cloud, so for trash fights, for example, Black Rose Prison, where you have a lot of trash, basically gives you a lot of healing done. So really powerful set here, but doesn't really provide any sort of group utility. Next we have Jail's Tenacity, which is another more selfish-oriented set, so when you do 7,000 more health in a single attack, you gain major vitality for 5 seconds. So, useful in certain situations, for example, Cloud Rest hard mode or Execute in order to help combat Baneful Mark. Lachesis, and any of the dragons actually in Sunspire do pretty decent amount of damage, so it's pretty nice to have this utility here, but it is also, as you can tell, more selfishly oriented. Next we have Dragon's Defilement, which is going to be more of a group-oriented set. So whenever you take damage from a melee attack, you gain a Corrupting Orb for 5 seconds that applies Minor Fracture and Minor Breach. So this is pretty strong, a really good replacement for enemy groups that don't have a Stamplar, or even if you do have a Stamplar, for that AoE Minor Fracture, Minor Breach on trash pulls. Just kind of saves your Stamplar from having to use Power of the Light on pretty much everything. So really nice set to have on hand for those sort of trash pulls there. Other dungeon sets that you might want to consider grabbing onto. You want to definitely grab Hircine's Veneer, especially in the stamina heavy sort of meta here. You will definitely be seeing Hircine's Veneer being used on a support role. Doesn't necessarily need to be a tank. It is a medium armor set, so you will need to have the jewelry and the weapons in order to effectively use this set here, because you don't want to be tanking in medium armor necessarily. Hircine just reduces the cost of stamina abilities by 4% for everybody in the group within 28 meters of you, up to 12 people. And then you have the Magicka version of Hircine's Veneer, which is Worm's Raiment. Basically just reduces the cost of Magicka abilities by 4%. Same thing as with Hircine, you just want to make sure that you're getting the jewelry and the weapons, that way you are not light armor tanking, which unfortunately in this patch is not really all that great. It's possible to do, but not really recommended. In terms of overland sets, there are a handful of overland sets that are pretty decent that you might want to consider picking up. First one's going to be Plague Doctor, which is the quintessential tanking set, just adds a bunch of max health, but doesn't provide any sort of group utility, so really good when you're starting to learn stuff, but you want to shy away from Plague Doctor once you start to learn mechanics and can focus in more on buffing and debuffing. Beyond that, you have Akaviri Dragonguard, which reduces the cost of ultimate by 15%, giving you greater major force uptime by reducing the time between your Warhorn casts. You have Livewire, which is basically an AoE concussion, which helps with off-balance uptime in trash fights, so pretty nice overall. It does also have additional healing as well, so a little bit of sustainability there. And then in terms of trial sets, I do want to talk about a medium trial set that you should have, which is going to be Roar of Alkosh, which still remains the strongest support set that a tank can wear. Whenever you activate a synergy, you deal a certain amount of physical damage, but the big thing is that you reduce the physical and spell resistance of any enemy hit by 3010 for 10 seconds. Tanks are probably in the best position to make use of the synergy. You can pretty much aim the synergy wherever you'd like, and it's a very, very powerful debuff. This usually translates to, at a bare minimum, 60% additional DPS done, so really, really powerful set here. This is a medium armor set, so you will need to get this in the jewelry and the weapons in order to make the most use out of it. That's pretty much all these sets. Moving on to our character sheet. I am an Imperial. Imperials are going to be one of the better races if you have access to them. Imperials are not a base game race here, so if you don't have access to Imperials, you can be something like a Nord instead, or an Argonian. Those are going to be the two probably better racial options when it comes to base game races. Keep in mind that for tanking success, race isn't as much big of an impact as on like a DPS, and that's mainly because tanking is more about knowing how to control the fight, basically knowing mechanics and things like that. So racial passives kind of help a little bit with that regard in terms of sustain and resources, but they don't really help with learning how to do mechanics. So race is not quite a big of an impact on tanks. Imperials, really quickly, they get max health and max stamina. They also get 3% cost reduction to across the board to all abilities, as well as 333 health, magic, and stamina back whenever they deal damage. Nords also get health and stamina, a little bit less stamina than Imperials do. They do get 3960 resistances across the board, so a little bit more survivability for Nords, plus they get some additional ultimate whenever they take damage. Argonians get health and magicka. They get 8% additional healing done, so that helps boost your self-heals as well as any sort of group heals you might be running. And then they get 4,000 magicka health and stamina back whenever they drink a potion. So that just helps out your overall sustain there, just giving you a bunch of resources whenever you drink a potion. In terms of attribute points, this is really going to depend on your race. So Imperials, for example, get 2,000 max health, and so you don't need to put nearly as much points into health here. Necromancers also get some additional max health through one of their racial class passives. So Necromancers, generally speaking, you won't be putting as much into health as you would on like a Dragonite, for example. So for example, here I have 30 magicka, 30 stamina, and 4 health, and we're sitting at 37.3k max health here with Ebon before toughness. So general rule of thumb is try to hit at least 35k max health with any sort of setup that you have, and then try to get above 20k max magicka and max stamina here. The higher your resources, the better off you'll be in terms of being able to continue to block or continue to use abilities that provide buffs or debuffs. So it's always good to get some additional max magicka and max stamina there. In terms of the Munda Stone, we are using the Atronach for the additional magicka regen, which is pretty important because a lot of our buff and debuff moves do use magicka, so we do want to maximize our overall magicka regen here. And we are using purple food, which increases our max health, max magicka, and max stamina. Going over our ability bars next. Starting off with our front bar, we have Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash, Hungry Scythe for our self-heal here. Pretty decent heal. It gives you 5.6k health on the first enemy that you hit. Then you have a nice heal over time as well. Necrotic Potency, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Necromancers can use corpses and generate ultimate, so this is how we're going to be generating our ultimate here. It also gives us additional heal as well. Next we have Expunge and Modify, which is a flex spot, so if you do need to purge anything, this is the best way to do so. Then you have Aggressive Warhorn here, which you can replace with a bunch of different ultimates. For your back bar, we have Inner Rage. Next we have Bounce for the Magicka Sustain, as well as Major Ward, Major Resolve. Elemental Blockade to help proc our enchants, or to help proc off balance. If you're running a bow back bar, you'll be using Endless Hail instead. Intensive Mender, this just generates a corpse, so that way we're able to use Necrotic Potency. It also is a pretty decent heal as well. And then we have Beckoning Armor, which is a flex spot here. Part of running Beckoning Armor is for the pull, but also creates a corpse when the effect is done. So that's also helpful for Necrotic Potency as well. The pull is once every 3 seconds, so not really that active. It's not going to be quite as fast as a DK running chains, but it's still better than nothing. You have aggressive Warhorn again. Now, in terms of other abilities you want to have on hand here, Colossus is not a bad option because it does provide that major vulnerability, but generally speaking, assuming you have Necromancers or is like as a DPS, you don't really need to run Colossus because Major Force from Warhorn is going to be, generally speaking, a little bit stronger. In terms of active abilities, you can run Avid Boneyard or Unnerving Boneyard. Really depends on kind of what you prefer. If you want the self synergy for better Alkosh uptime, then Avid Boneyard is the way to go. If you want the sort of group utility of applying AoE Major Breach and Fracture, then Unnerving Boneyard is going to be better. Under the Bone Tyrant line, the Totem, either Agony Totem or Remote Totem, are both pretty decent for the minor protection. So really good for that, but it also is your hard CC. So this is your Fear ability. So Fear, if you guys haven't kept up with the changes, no longer causes enemies to run from you. It now causes them to cower. So they'll basically act as a hard root. So Remote Totem or Agony Totem is going to be your rooting skill, your hard CC skills. Under Living Death, if you need additional healing or some additional stamina, you can also run Mortal Coil. It's a little bit trickier to use because you do need to target a corpse, and unfortunately you're not running anything like Blast Bones or anything, so you're going to need to make sure that you can see a corpse in order to target it in order to use Mortal Coil. It's a little bit tricky to run, but it is possible to use. Let's see here. Immovable is not that bad. It does improve the amount that you can block, is depending on how many heavy armor pieces that you have here. So if you're running, for example, 7 heavy armor, you can block additional 35% damage, but your movement speed will be reduced down to 100 by 100%. So you can't move if you're running 7 pieces of heavy armor and you use immovable. But it is pretty decent. It's not a bad skill to run. Moving on from there. Ringer Preservation is a good skill to have for the minor protection as well as the weakish heal here. It's not terrible, but it's definitely not a very strong heal either. Really great when you need to stack up for sort of damage mitigation or any sort of mechanics, so just provides some additional minor protection that way. Under the Surgical Order line, if you have access to the line here, you can go with Temporal Guard for minor protection and slot it on your front bar here. Then you also have Deep Thoughts or Introspection for some additional resource sustain here. Necromancers don't really have a source of stamina sustain unless you're running Mortal Coil, and so you might just want to run something like Introspection or Deep Thoughts combined with Beckoning Armor for your Major Ward, Major Resolve. Under the Indulgent line, make sure you have all these unlocked here. Overflowing Altar will give you the Lifesteal as well as the Blood Feast synergy. Shadow Silk will give you the Shadow Silk synergy, which is still fairly decent in terms of damage. It's still free damage essentially. Obviously you have your range taunt, you have Bone Surge for the shield as well as the Major Vitality bonus, which is situationally useful. Cloud Rest to execute, for example. And then Energy Orb for the heal as well as the Combustion synergy, which helps return resources back. With the change to orbs, only 1 orb out at a time. It's actually pretty easy to sustain Energy Orbs on a tank, so don't think it's going to be very difficult. It's actually pretty easy to sustain 1 orb out every 10 seconds. Echoing Vigor for a self-heal as well as a group heal. And then Efficient Purge if you need to purge things from multiple people and not just yourself, otherwise you just use Expunge and Modify. And Reviving Barrier as another flex ultimate to run here. Next, go over our champion points, which I do believe I need to adjust here really quickly here. But generally speaking, the main points you want to hit are going to be your Arcanist, as well as Shadow Ward. So you want to hit at the very least 61 or 66 in Shadow Ward. Higher is always better if you're able to do that. And then 64 or 75 in Arcanist for additional Magicka regen. From there, you can kind of put your nodes really wherever you feel comfortable, where you feel like you need them. So for example, 40 Warlord, 40 Tumbling, 49 Tenacity. That'll hit all of my jump points, so that way I'm able to make the most use out of my CPs. In terms of blue CPs, you want to get 81 into Precise Strikes here, 81 into Elfborn, that way you get the jump point, 24% jump point, 100 points into Blessed, and then the 8 remaining points can be placed wherever because it doesn't really matter where you put them. There are some heals that do scale off of either your max weapon damage or your spell damage, so you just want to make sure to have that active on both sides here, so Precise Strikes and Elfborn. Then Red CPs, this is a balanced approach, so we have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 64 in both Hardy Elemental Defender. Depending on the type of damage that you're taking in a trial, you might need to shift these points around in order to best maximize your mitigation. But that is essentially it for this build stuff. So really quickly, what separates Necro tanks from DK tanks? Well, to start off with, already mentioned this at the beginning of the video, you have no sort of passive buffs. So all of your passives are fairly selfishly oriented. You don't really have any sort of group utility, so you're not really providing anything like Minor Brutality or Minor Prophecy, stuff that other classes are able to cover. Instead, you will basically be what I like to call an ultimate battery. You basically generate a ton of ultimate and just pump out Warhorns like crazy. The way you do that is with Intensive Mender and Beckoning Armor, or the other morph if you prefer to have that morph instead. So you'll see that you basically create a corpse if you activate an ability with less than 50% time remaining. So if we use armor now, we have 2 corpses, and then I use expend Necrotic Potency, and I get some ultimate. So you did see my ultimate go up here, and it's going to go up again by 6. And that's basically more or less how you want to play a Necromancer tank. You want to basically play it more as a kind of ultimate generator rather than just a kind of buff debuff kind of thing. There are some pretty good buffs and debuffs in the game that Necromancer is able to provide, but a lot of it is kind of situationally useful. So for example, Unnerving Boneyard for the Major Breach, Major Fracture is really great in AoE pulls, but for boss fights, single target fights, you already have it through Pierced Armor, so not really useful. Same thing with Minor Protection. There are various sources of Minor Protection that you're able to provide for the group, so things like Agony Totem might not necessarily be unique to a Necromancer tank. It's certainly a good way to provide it that does not use stamina like Circular Protection does or an ultimate, but there are other ways to get those sort of buffs. So really the Necromancer tank really shines in generating a lot of ultimate very quickly, especially in trash fights where you're just able to use your Necrotic Potency on, let's say, 10 adds, and you instantly get 60 ultimate as well as the heal that is associated with it. So pretty strong overall. Now in terms of tanking, there's really 3 jobs that a tank needs to fulfill here. Taunt the enemy, stay alive, manage buffs and debuffs. As a Necromancer tank, I've already kind of mentioned this, but your buffs and debuffs aren't really coming from class abilities, they're more coming from your sets, so things like Alkosh, Yolnahkriin, if you're running something like Martial Knowledge, things like that. And then from there, it's just kind of managing your uptimes there. So the first thing you need to do as a tank is obviously learn how to survive, learn the mechanics of the fight. That way you're able to actually be a good tank. A dead tank obviously is not a good tank. So once you learn how to survive the mechanics of the fight, and as a tank, you will be the one more or less choreographing the fight. You'll be the one directing the fight, shouting out specific mechanics, knowing how to deal with the mechanics. Tanking requires a lot of kind of foresight and a lot of kind of pre-planning to kind of know what you need to do here. Beyond that, once you get comfortable with the fight, it's just managing your buff and debuffs. Part of it is sort of situational awareness, especially if you're running Alkosh. You kind of need to be able to time out your synergies. So in order to get the most uptime, you need to make sure you're keeping track of whatever buff that you might already be providing through other skills. And for Necromancer tanks specifically, you just want to make sure that you're getting those corpses out by running mostly Intensive Mender, but also Beckoning Armor as well. That way you're able to get those sort of ultimate going, so that way you can get off your Warhorns. Now one thing I will point out about Necromancer tanks is that your self-heal is not that great. Your Vicious Hungry Scythe only gives about just over 5k health or so, which ends up being around, actually let's see how much it returns now. The return, yeah, 5.6k health on a 37k max health, so really not that great. You're not even really hitting 20% max health here. You do get a little bit of a heal over time, but you do want to be a little bit careful of this. You don't really have a strong burst heal like a DK does with Green Dragonblood, so be a little bit more proactive when it comes to avoiding damage on a Necromancer tank. Beyond that, though, the only way to learn how to be a good tank is to actually practice tanking. I do recommend checking out some of my streams on Twitch as well as on YouTube to kind of see how I approach tanking. I do tank mainly on a DK, but tanking strategies, generally speaking, more or less exactly the same across different classes. The toolkit varies a little bit here and there. But beyond that, if you guys have any questions about the build or about tanking in general, feel free to ask questions here in the comment section, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. But other than that, I hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.